We'll get into the details of the commission. I've really broken the presentation down into two areas. One is around the need, the municipal need for additional investment in water infrastructure, and really paying closer attention to the public health, public safety, and economic needs around water infrastructure and maintenance. Also on the innovation side, I think we have real opportunities here in Massachusetts for water innovation, which are very exciting, and I want to share some of those with you. But I'm starting off on sort of a personal note because at the end of the day, while all of you work on water professionally, I've found in my experience working on this issue for, I guess, more than close to 15 years now, water is very much a personal issue for people. And for anyone who has ever had a situation in their community where there is any impression even that there may be some concern with the water supply, you quickly realize how personal an issue it is. It relates to your families, it relates to your children. So, you know, it's a very powerful issue, and it's actually been quite surprising to me when I first came in and I was listening to Senator Eldridge give a presentation about how water was not a sexy issue at the State House, and this was about 5 years ago. Really surprised me because in all of my time in public office, water had been a consistent and a constant issue for us as local municipalities. And so glad to see so many people, you know, focused on this issue. So to answer a quick question, why have I spent so much of my time on water? At the end of the day, it comes back to these three right here in the front, who are my three kids who grew up spending summers in Maine on a lake. And up here, the little guy on the right-hand side, that's my dad, who spent all of his summers growing up on the very same lake. And I, from a very young age, started to hear his commentary about how much the quality of the lake had changed just in his lifetime due to development that had happened around the shores, and how much the wildlife had changed, the water quality had changed. So I sort of understood intrinsically when I came into the communities that there's a very close connection between how we develop, how we manage our water, and our quality of life, and our recreation, and our ability to you know that we're protecting our family. There we go. So I'll start off just very quickly. There's a lot of information here, and I'm really going to hit the highlights. Due to the time constraints, I would encourage people, if they have questions, let's just do questions as we go, rather than saving them to the end. So just raise your hands, and I'll try to point you out. The commission was established in 2009 by an act of the legislature in the 2009 budget, with a very specific set of things that we needed to focus on. We needed to identify a financial gap, to look at a 25-year span of water across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, water infrastructure, determine what the needs were for investment, determine what the current level of investment and financial commitment was, and identify the gap, which was the funding that we would need to figure out a way to provide to make sure that our public was protected. Develop funding mechanisms specifically, best handling and management, which really speaks to best practices, identify potential threats, and expand the use of more best practices, including full cost accounting and enterprise funding for water infrastructure. So we had a very specific mandate starting out with this commission. Very similar, by the way, to the Transportation Finance Commission, which issued a similar report, which is the basis for some of the transportation conversations we're having now. This is not an abstract issue, and one of the things that we really did was reach out to communities to get the frontline thinking, what communities were really facing, and heard overwhelmingly that water, once asked, water quickly rose to the top of the local infrastructure, and the concerns around the types of investments they were able to make were concerned. So this is just a high level of quick headlines we were able to find online highlighting some of the water challenges that we're facing today, with water main breaks, with displacing residents due to water main breaks, urgent action needed on wastewater. These are all happening today in our communities. So here's the bottom line. In evaluating the gap, we looked at real data for real projects that are actually in the queue and have been requested by municipalities today. So we feel pretty confident that this is a very real number. This is a what I would consider a conservative number in terms of needs going forward. We looked at 3 types of water needs: drinking water, clean water, and then storm water as a third category. Drinking water and clean water. Can everyone hear me okay? Way in the back? Can I use? Okay, good. I'm not going to bother with that then. So drinking water and clean water are 2 types of water infrastructure that currently have dedicated funding streams today. while not adequate funding streams, they at least have a dedicated funding stream. Stormwater came up as the one issue that all of us believe was sort of the elephant in the room, where it's really an emerging need, and in fact, if you look at the potential size of that emerging need, it actually dwarfs the needs of both water and wastewater. And if you combine the need over the next 20 years for all three of those categories, you're at $40 billion over 20 years, which is a pretty dramatic need, considering the transportation conversation, again, that we're paying so much attention to, is a $20 billion need. So half of that total water need definitely merits our attention. The key challenges, again, there's a 100-page report. I don't know how many of you looked at it. I really tried to just pull out the highlights, and if people have questions, we can certainly get into more detail. Overall, the challenges being faced by the communities: decreases in federal and state funding. The Clean Water Act provided a lot of federal funding to communities. In fact, back when I started, back in 1999, my first public service endeavor around a sewer in my local community, I heard rumor that back in the 70s, when this project was initially proposed for our community, 90% of that project would have been paid for by federal and state resources. When we were looking at that project, probably 95% of that cost would have been borne by the local community. Dramatic shift in just 30 years over the available funding for water infrastructure. Regulatory compliance emerged quite frequently. The increasing needs and understanding of the challenges around protecting our water supply, and very valid challenges around things like pharmaceuticals and contaminants that we need to address regulatorily. But what we heard was a disturbing dynamic where, faced with limited resources, communities were dedicating resources to meeting regulatory requirements and failing to invest in the very basic water investments and maintenance that is just sort of the bread and butter of keeping these systems working. There was significant amount of debt for the same reasons that communities are facing because of federal and state funding decreases. A lot of the regional systems, a lot of the communities have been forced to take on debt that they were continuing to pay for. I think a great case in point is MWRA, which is still carrying debt from the Boston Harbor Cleanup Project, which is very much reflected in its rates. And today, MWRA, 60 cents on every dollar that MWRA has goes toward debt service, which is simply not a sustainable situation financially. We looked across the board at best management practices. One of the things that we always focus on in the legislature is reform. Are we doing things as efficiently and effectively as we can be? And are we using resources to the greatest public value? And when we looked at these BMPs across the different communities, dramatic differences in how communities were dealing with water. Some of them had a lot of BMPs in place: enterprise funding, full cost accounting, really great. Other communities really had not been. And the most dramatic, I think, takeaway from that study was the difference between larger cities and larger municipalities and many of our smaller communities who simply did not have the available resources to do a lot of the planning that, quite frankly, would serve them much better over the longer term. But they just couldn't get there. And then the limited regional planning. Again, at the state level, in virtually every sector of what we do, we look for opportunities to regionalize, and it's sort of been a theme: how can we do more with less? Very little of that was happening in the water world, and we think there's really opportunity to do more there. Any questions before I move on? So here are the recommendations at a top line that the committee came out with. We identified the gap, and we really took a very detailed approach to determining how we are going to fill that gap. And at the end of the day, we did I guess what you call sort of a sensitivity analysis as to how we were going to fill that gap. And sort of the takeaway is we're going to fill it with, in some cases, with rates and local community contributions, with a significantly increased state contribution. And the way that breaks out, we looked at different levels of state contributions. You can see it up here. If we zero state contribution, 50 million, state annual contribution, 100 million, 200 million. And then we looked at community rates. And so the takeaway is here, obviously, if we pay for it all with the rates, that's the scenario. If we set rates at 1.25% of median household income for every community, and we at the state level contribute $200 million into our water infrastructure every year, we can close that substantial, sizable gap in 20 years. So this is very much a doable public policy initiative for us if we put our minds to getting it done. The program to come up with that $200 million and distribute that, we actually got into, again, some more detail. What the recommendation of the committee was with that $200 million is to dedicate 40% of that annually to the existing, to the existing SRF loan program, low interest loan program. Take 40% of it, create a new grant program for communities, and then 20%, the remaining 20% would be dedicated, similar to the current Chapter 90 transportation funding, would go, some funding would go to each of the 351 cities and towns across the Commonwealth, dedicated toward not only pipes in the ground and water infrastructure, but also with the intent of giving some of these smaller communities some resources with which they could do some of that long-term planning that we had talked about earlier. The remainder of the recommendation, reduce costs and find efficiencies. There were actually quite a number of opportunities there that the Commission's work laid out. Amongst them, things like requiring asset management plans, requiring capital management plans, requiring enterprise funding. The way we addressed that in the legislation, which I'll talk about a little differently, is to really use kind of an incentive approach rather than a hammer approach, if you know what I'm saying. Assist in retiring debt. One of the other recommendations of the Commission was to refund the line item for rate relief, which had been given for a number of years. It was $50 to $60 million at its peak every year, given to regional entities, regional water entities, to retire debt, much of which went to MWRA. We're looking to institute that, at least for a finite period of time, to help MWRA deal with its debt concerns. Address affordability, and I think this point is probably going to generate some of the most conversation, I think, as we try to move this initiative forward. We recognize, as a legislature, and I'm sure many of you recognize, that depending on the community that you're working in, there are different levels of affordability given for different communities, and we really felt it was important to address that and how we provided funding as a state. And the proposal that we'll talk about in a minute through the legislation was, we looked at median household income, and we borrowed an approach that the federal government had used in allocating resources for smaller community grants, to say we recognize that if you have the amount of rates locally you're expected to pay should be proportionate to your median household income. And the benchmark that we set was 2.5% median household income combined should be really the cap at which the state gives you extra consideration for the funding from the state. And that is reflected in the legislation we'll be talking about.